The steam hissed from the iron monster behind them, curling into the cold morning air like a snake ready to strike. The station's platform was a sea of muted browns and greys, wool coats brushing against each other in the restless shuffle of travelers. I had been standing in the crowd for 20 minutes, my gloved fingers tight around the envelope in my pocket, the divorce papers folded so sharply it felt like they might cut through the fabric. Then I saw him, Edward, his profile unmistakable, his hand protectively resting on the small of her back. Margaret Ashby. I'd seen her only once before, and that was enough. Her hair was coiled like spun chestnut silk, her coat fitted too perfectly for someone without means. She laughed at something Edward said, her head tilted just so, carefully staged, like a photograph meant to be kept in a breast pocket. I waited for my pulse to steady. My boots tapped softly against the cobblestones beneath the awning as I began walking toward them, each step rehearsed in my mind for the past 2 sleepless nights. When Edward turned and saw me, the colour left his face so fast it was as though the station lamps had dimmed. Margaret's eyes darted between us, reading something in his expression she didn't like. I didn't speak. I reached into my coat, drew out the envelope, and held it between us. The paper trembled only from the wind, not from my hands. The heading, Dinorgsdort, was printed in bold, the words backwards from his perspective but not mine. A murmur rose from the crowd behind me, the sound of strangers who'd caught scent of a scandal. Edward didn't take the papers immediately. His suitcase hung heavy in his right hand, his left frozen in mid-air. Margaret's brow furrowed, but she didn't step back. If anything, she shifted slightly closer to him, as though claiming territory. The train's whistle screamed above us, drowning out the clamour for a moment, but my gaze stayed locked on his. Finally, he reached for the envelope. His fingers brushed mine briefly, cold, damp, like the grip of a man who had been holding on to too many secrets for too long. Our eyes met, and for a heartbeat I expected guilt, shame, maybe even defiance. Instead, there was something else entirely. Fear, the kind that makes a man's pupils tighten and his breath go shallow. I didn't understand it yet, but it was enough to stop me from turning away. "What is this?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible over the churning pistons. I didn't answer. Words would have been too generous. The papers spoke for themselves. Pages of legally inked endings, dates, signatures, the clean severing of a bond that had long since withered. His knuckles whitened as he held them. Margaret's lips parted as though she might intervene, but no sound came out. Behind them, the locomotive let out a great exhale of smoke, casting everything in a shroud of shifting grey. The crowd moved like a tide around us, but in that moment it felt as though the 3 of us stood in a painting, frozen, suspended between decision and consequence. I let my gaze fall briefly to Margaret's gloved hand, which had slipped discreetly into the crook of Edward's arm. She wasn't afraid, not of me, not of this confrontation, which meant she already knew something I didn't. I stepped back, intending to walk away, to let the finality of my gesture seal itself in silence, but Edward's eyes followed me with a desperate urgency. "Clara, wait." It was the first time he'd said my name in weeks, and it cracked in the air between us. The whistle blew again, longer this time, as if urging us all to make our choices quickly, and for reasons I couldn't yet name, I knew this wasn't just about another woman. Something else was pulling him toward that train, something darker and far more dangerous than love. Before there was Margaret, before the whispered names and the glances that lingered too long, there was the war. Edward had gone to France in 1916 with a sharp salute and a grin that made the neighbours call him our brave boy. When he came home in 19, that grin was gone. In its place was a taut, restless expression, as if his skin no longer fit him. Nights were the worst. He would bolt upright, drenched in sweat, muttering names I didn't know, clutching at the sheets like they were the earth he was trying to crawl into. At first I made excuses for him. The war had taken from everyone. It had left some without limbs, others without sons, and all of us without the illusion that life was safe. We still had our house on Waverley Street, my small garden out back, and the routine of shared tea in the evenings. But the man sitting across from me was not my husband, not really. He was a ghost in well-pressed suits, a presence that filled the room without ever truly being there. In the summer of 1923, the changes grew more tangible. He began disappearing for entire weekends, claiming business trips to Liverpool that produced neither income nor explanation. He returned smelling faintly of tobacco I didn't recognize and carrying books in French that he never read. When I asked, he would offer a smile, polite, hollow, and steer the conversation toward the weather. It was during one of these weekends that I found the first letter. It was tucked inside the pocket of his wool coat, addressed in a looping, confident hand. No name on the front, just the words "for your eyes only." Inside was a single train ticket to Paris, dated for November 1924, and a note written in careful ink, "We leave together. The sooner the better." There was no signature. My chest tightened, but even then I wasn't certain it was about love. Something in the clipped phrasing suggested urgency, not romance. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I began watching him, learning his patterns, noting the new places he visited, the way his eyes darted at the mention of certain names in the newspapers. One evening, while he was in the bath, I went to his desk. Beneath a stack of unpaid bills, I found another envelope, this one containing photographs. Edward with men I had never seen before, all in dark overcoats, standing on a street I didn't recognize. One of the men had a scar running from temple to jaw. All of them were looking at the camera as though they had been told not to. By October, I had decided what I would do. I went to my solicitor, a pale, fussy man named Mr. Ellison, and requested divorce papers. He looked surprised. Ladies did not often make such requests without their husband's knowledge, but he prepared them swiftly. I signed them in his office, the scratch of my pen sounding far louder than it should have. I folded the documents neatly into an envelope, sealing them with the same calm precision I used when hemming a dress. 2 weeks later, I overheard Edward on the telephone speaking in a low-clipped tone. "The border by night," he said. "No delays." The words lodged themselves in my chest like shrapnel. That night I resolved not only to end our marriage, but to do so at the exact moment he intended to leave. If he was going to abandon me at the station, I would be there first, and I would make sure he knew I was not the sort of woman one simply walked away from. I had made it halfway down the station steps before the cold air finally reached me. It wasn't just the November chill, it was the emptiness that followed after a confrontation. My hands, which had been steady moments before, now trembled faintly inside my gloves. The echo of Edward's voice, "Clara, wait," still lingered, but I ignored it. I wanted distance. I wanted the hard certainty of cobblestones under my boots and the feeling that I was leaving him behind, not the other way around. That was when I noticed the man leaning against the iron railing. Tall, with a frame made for manual work, but dressed in the tidy navy uniform of the station, he was unmistakably someone in authority here. His cap was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but I could feel his gaze following me. When I drew level with him, he straightened, blocking my path with a subtle shift. "Mrs. Weston," he said, his voice even, as though we were already acquainted. I stopped, more out of surprise than politeness. "You know my name?" I asked. He gave a brief nod. "Samuel Harper, station master." His eyes flicked toward the platform where Edward and Margaret still stood, half shrouded in steam. "You may not believe me, but you ought to be careful. Your husband, he's in the middle of something bigger than the pair of you." I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I assure you, Mr. Harper, there's nothing bigger than what just happened on that platform." His gaze didn't waver. "He's been meeting with men, 3 of them, always the same. Long coats, foreign accents. I saw him with them last week near the freight yard. They passed him an envelope, and whatever was in it, he guarded like his own life depended on it. One of the men had a scar, right here." Harper traced a finger along his jawline. My stomach clenched. I wanted to dismiss him, to tell him that this was none of his concern, but then he said, "I heard a bit of their talk. They said, 'the border by night,' and something about not being followed." The words fell into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd been assembling. They matched exactly what I'd overheard Edward say on the telephone. Harper's eyes softened slightly. "I don't know you, Mrs. Weston, but I can tell you this much. Whatever train he's catching today, it's not just about a woman." He tipped his cap, stepping aside so I could pass. I walked away without answering, my thoughts a jagged tangle. Behind me, the whistle screamed again, and I realized with sudden clarity that Edward Weston wasn't simply leaving me. He was running from something, and Margaret Ashby might not be who she appeared to be at all. The fog clung to the city that evening, rolling low along the riverbanks and curling through the narrow lanes like a living thing. I had not gone home after leaving the station. Instead, I kept to the shadows, the hem of my coat brushing against damp brick as I moved through streets I barely knew. If Edward was planning to cross the border by night, I meant to learn why, and with whom. Samuel Harper's warning had set a quiet fire in me, burning hotter than my anger over Margaret. From a discreet distance I watched the station's main exit. Crowds ebbed and flowed, each departure swallowed by the night, until finally I saw him, Edward, emerge with Margaret at his side. But they didn't head for the carriage rank as I expected. Instead, they turned sharply toward the freight yards, where the air was thicker with smoke and the lamplight was scarce. I followed, keeping to the edges, the sound of their footsteps masked by the hiss of steam from idle engines. They stopped near a row of coal wagons. A man stepped out from behind them, tall, broad-shouldered, his long coat buttoned to the throat. Even from where I stood, I could see the faint silver scar along his jaw, the same scar Harper had described. Edward glanced over his shoulder once, as though sensing eyes on him, but Margaret touched his arm, murmuring something I couldn't hear. The scarred man handed him a small packet, no larger than a cigarette case wrapped in brown paper and bound with string. For a moment, Edward just stared at it. Then he slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. I caught the glint of metal in the stranger's hand, perhaps a lighter, perhaps something far more dangerous. Margaret's eyes flickered in my direction then, scanning the shadows. I pressed myself against the side of a wagon, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure she could hear it. A whistle sounded in the distance, 3 short bursts. The scarred man responded with a subtle signal of his own, raising 2 fingers and lowering them slowly. Edward and Margaret turned away, heading toward the far end of the yard where a smaller unlit carriage stood waiting. I moved to follow, but by the time I reached the spot, they were gone. Only the faint scent of tobacco lingered, unfamiliar and bitter. I stood there in the dark, the damp seeping through my shoes, thinking about that packet. Whatever it was, Edward guarded it like treasure, and the man who gave it to him did not look like someone you approached with casual conversation. If Edward was entangled in something illegal, or worse, I was no longer a mere spectator in a broken marriage. I was standing at the edge of something that could swallow us all whole. I returned to Waverley Street just before midnight, my coat damp and my thoughts frayed at the edges. The house was dark, but I knew Edward wouldn't be there. If his plans had gone as intended, he was already halfway to whatever border he spoke of. The key turned easily in the lock, and I stepped into the stillness, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Every shadow felt sharper than usual, every creak in the wood, a whisper of something unseen. I lit a single lamp in the study, its glow falling across the familiar chaos of Edward's desk. Receipts, discarded envelopes, a chipped inkwell, his life in paper form, scattered without care. I began searching through the drawers, methodical but quick, my ears tuned for the sound of a key in the door. In the bottom right drawer, beneath a stack of ledgers, I found a half-burned letter, the edges curled inward like black petals, the center still legible in places. The handwriting was not Edward's. The ink was dark, the script precise. The timetable is fixed. Delay is unacceptable. The asset must not be intercepted. Cross at Calais. Destroy this note. The signature was nothing more than a symbol, an angular mark that looked like 2 interlocking triangles. My fingers traced the charred edge, smearing ash onto my gloves. Asset, I whispered aloud. Not a person's name, not a romantic plea, a coded reference. I glanced toward the fireplace where the rest of the letter's fragments lay buried in grey ash. Using the poker, I stirred gently, hoping for more. A corner of paper shifted, revealing a partial line, list enclosed within packet. My mind leapt to the brown paper-wrapped case I'd seen Edward receive in the freight yard. Whatever was inside, it wasn't meant for love letters or photographs. It was meant to be delivered to someone powerful and dangerous. For the first time that night, a sliver of fear slid under my skin. If Edward was transporting something of value to strangers across the border, then his absence from our life was not the worst fate he might face. A prison cell, or worse, could be waiting for him. And yet, part of me, bitter and bruised as I was, didn't know whether I wanted to warn him or let him step into the snare. The clock on the mantel chimed once, breaking the stillness. I folded what remained of the letter into my pocket and turned down the lamp. Tomorrow I would have to decide, pursue the truth to its end or close the door on him forever. But something told me this matter would not allow for half measures. I found her the next afternoon, not in some Paris-bound carriage, but in the tea room of the Grand Continental Hotel. She sat alone at a table near the window, her gloved hands wrapped around a delicate porcelain cup. The sunlight through the glass turned her hair to molten copper, but her eyes, sharp, appraising, were fixed on the newspaper she barely seemed to read. I approached quietly, my boots muffled by the thick carpet. "Margaret Ashby," I said. She looked up, and in that split second I knew 2 things. First, she recognized me instantly. Second, she was not surprised to see me. "Mrs. Weston," she replied, her tone as smooth as the cream she stirred into her tea. "Or should I say Miss, now?" I ignored the barb and sat opposite her without invitation. "Edward isn't with you." "No," she said simply, her gaze holding mine. "And you should be glad of it. He's not in a position to keep anyone safe at the moment." The way she said it was not the voice of a jealous mistress or a guilty woman. It was the measured cadence of someone weighing how much truth to give away. I leaned forward. "You were in the freight yard last night. I saw you take him to that man, the one with the scar." She didn't flinch. Instead, she set down her cup with deliberate care. "His name is not important. What matters is that your husband is in possession of something that, if it crosses the channel, will change the balance of more than just his marriage. That packet contains names, agents, people embedded in places they should not be." The room seemed suddenly smaller, the clink of cups around us fading beneath her words. "And you?" I asked. "What's your place in this?" Margaret's lips curved, not in amusement, but in something closer to pity. "I'm not on Edward's side. I was sent to stop him. Paris was never our destination, Mrs. Weston. Calais is, and if he reaches it, you won't be the only one who loses." Her eyes flicked toward the door, as though expecting someone, or fearing them. "If you still care for him, warn him. If you don't, walk away now, because the next few days will be dangerous for everyone involved." She rose, smoothed her coat, and left without waiting for me to answer. I sat there, the taste of her words bitter on my tongue, realizing that my husband's betrayal might be the least dangerous thing about him. The city seemed to hold its breath that night. Fog rolled in from the river, swallowing the gas lamps and turning the streets into a dim labyrinth. Margaret's warning replayed in my head, like the ticking of a clock I couldn't silence. Paris was never our destination. Calais is. If she was telling the truth, Edward wasn't running to a new life. He was running straight into a dangerous exchange, and I was the only one who could intercept it. At 11:30, I was back at the station, my coat pulled tight and my hair pinned beneath a plain cloche hat. I kept to the shadows beyond the freight yard, the crunch of gravel under my boots almost too loud in the stillness. Somewhere nearby, a lone engine hissed, releasing a plume of steam that momentarily blinded me. When it cleared, I saw them, Edward, the scarred man, and another figure I didn't recognize, shorter, wearing a dark bowler hat. They were standing beside a low, covered wagon. The scarred man produced the brown paper packet I'd seen before, holding it up in the dim light. Edward reached for it, but the man didn't let go immediately. There was a pause, an unspoken exchange. Finally, the man's grip loosened. Edward slipped the packet into his coat, and the bowler-hatted figure stepped closer, speaking in rapid French. My schoolgirl lessons weren't perfect, but I caught enough to understand. There was a train leaving at 1 o'clock, bound for Dover. I moved closer, weaving between stacked crates, my breath visible in the cold. I was so focused on Edward that I didn't hear the footsteps behind me until a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun, my heart pounding, to find Margaret staring at me in the gloom. "I told you to stay away," she whispered fiercely. "If they see you, you won't make it out of here." "I'm not here to save him," I said. "I'm here to know the truth." Her grip tightened, then loosened just enough to pull me farther into the shadows. "You'll get your truth soon enough," she muttered. Then, from our hiding place, she pointed to the scarred man's coat. In its inside pocket was a second packet, larger, flatter, and sealed with wax. "That," she whispered, "is not meant for him. That's the real prize. If you want to stop this, you need to take it before they board the train." The whistle blew in the distance, long and low. Edward turned toward the sound, and in that moment I realized Margaret's plan. She wasn't just here to stop Edward, she was using me to get to the scarred man. And if I played along, I might not live to see the morning. The midnight platform was a fever dream of smoke and motion. Porters shouting over the roar of the locomotive, travelers jostling under the flicker of gaslights, the air thick with the scent of coal and damp wool. I kept my head down, weaving through the crowd, Margaret just a pace behind me. The scarred man and Edward moved toward the third carriage from the rear, the packet in the man's coat swaying slightly with each step. We had seconds, maybe less. The whistle screamed, and the train began to hiss impatiently, the pistons exhaling in great gusts. Margaret's hand brushed my arm, our unspoken signal. I moved forward, letting the tide of passengers carry me closer. The scarred man paused to light a cigarette, his coat momentarily open. My gloved fingers slipped inside, brushing the cold wax of the packet. For a moment, it was in my grasp. Then a shout split the air. "Police, stand aside!" Two uniformed men pushed through the crowd from the far end of the platform, their eyes locked on Edward. The scarred man spun, his cigarette falling, and his hand shot out to clamp around my wrist. "Who are you?" His voice was low but lethal. I struggled, the packet still in my grip, until Margaret stepped between us, speaking in a rush of French I barely understood. He hesitated just long enough for me to wrench free. The police reached Edward first. One grabbed his arm while the other reached into his coat and pulled out the smaller brown paper packet. My breath caught. That was the one I'd seen him receive in the freight yard, the one tied to his arrest. He was shouting, denying, twisting against their hold. The scarred man vanished into the smoke, and I realized with a jolt that the real packet, the one in my hands, was the reason Margaret had brought me here at all. "Run!" she hissed. We plunged into the crush of bodies as the train began to move. Steam enveloped us, cloaking our escape. My lungs burned, my legs aching as we reached the end of the platform. Only then did I look at what I held. The wax seal bore the same angular mark I'd seen on the half-burned letter in Edward's desk, and somewhere deep in my chest, I knew whatever was inside could destroy more than just my marriage. It could start a war. We didn't stop running until we reached a narrow alley 2 streets from the station, the echo of the whistle fading into the fog. My breath came in sharp, uneven pulls. The packet clutched so tightly in my hand that the wax seal had left an imprint in my glove. Margaret leaned against the brick wall, her chest rising and falling, eyes fixed on me. "You can open it," she said, her tone unreadable. The seal cracked under my fingers with a brittle snap. Inside, layers of thin paper were folded so precisely they seemed almost mechanical. I unfolded them one by one until the truth stared back at me. A list of names, nationalities, and locations. Men and women embedded in key positions across Europe. Ambassadors, clerks, railway operators, even a minister's secretary. At the top of the page, a title in French, Réseau de l'Ombre, the Shadow Network. My stomach tightened. These weren't just spies. These were people who could shape the course of nations if their identities fell into the wrong hands. And here I was, standing in a wet alley in London, holding the entire web in my grasp. Margaret's voice broke my thoughts. "Now you understand. That's what Edward was carrying without even realizing it. The smaller packet was a decoy, enough to get him arrested, keep the authorities satisfied while the real prize slipped away." I stared at her. "So you used me?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because he trusts you even in anger, and you were angry enough to act without thinking about the cost." A low rumble of voices grew at the mouth of the alley. Police, perhaps, or worse. Margaret stepped forward. "You have 2 choices. Hand it to me, and I'll make sure it never reaches Calais. Or keep it, and you'll be hunted for the rest of your life. And Edward," she hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the street, "Edward will hang." I looked down at the names again, feeling the weight of each one. Somewhere in the fog beyond, my husband was in a cell cursing my name, and yet, for the first time in years, I was holding something that gave me the power to decide his fate. The train to Calais hissed in the darkness like a caged thing ready to be loosed. I stood on the far end of the platform, the packet hidden inside my coat, its edges pressing against my ribs with every breath. The fog was thicker here, rolling in waves across the tracks, muffling the murmur of passengers boarding under the watchful eyes of porters. Somewhere down the line, Margaret was already in position, her gaze fixed on me, as if my choice would either save or damn her. The list in my pocket felt heavier than any suitcase. Every name was a life, every location a lever that could shift the balance of a fragile continent. In my mind, I saw Edward, his face pale under the station lamps, his voice when he'd called my name. I had loved him once with a kind of blind loyalty that war and betrayal had burned away. But love wasn't the question anymore. The question was whether he deserved to be spared the consequences of his own ignorance. A bell clanged, and the train began to creep forward. Margaret appeared at my side without warning, her coat collar turned up against the cold. "This is the last chance," she said. "If you give it to me now, I can disappear before they even notice. If not, well, I hope you have a plan." I did not answer her. Instead, I stepped forward, matching the train's slow crawl until I reached the second carriage. A man in a constable's cap was helping passengers aboard. In his eyes, I saw no recognition, just the professional indifference of someone moving bodies from platform to carriage. I pressed the packet into his hand without a word and kept walking. Margaret's sharp intake of breath followed me. "What have you done?" "Given it to the only person here whose loyalty I can't guess at," I said. "Let the authorities sort it out. At least then, It won't be in the hands of someone who sees people as chess pieces. By the time I reached the street, the train's whistle was wailing into the fog. Behind me, footsteps approached. But when I turned, it wasn't Margaret. It was Samuel Harper, his cap low over his brow. "Your husband's been released," he said quietly. "The charges won't stick without that packet." I searched his face. "And what happens to him now?" Harper's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's up to him. And maybe, in a way, up to you." He tipped his cap and vanished into the mist, leaving me alone on the empty cobblestones. Somewhere a clock struck midnight, and for the first time in years I realized I was free, not because Edward had left me, but because I had finally left him. If you were hooked by this story and want more tales filled with twists, danger, and drama, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video to let us know you want more gripping narratives just like this one, and share it with someone who loves a good shock ending. Your support keeps the stories coming.